Welcome everyone. For those returning from past sessions, super glad to see you all here. I also know we have some new faces too. So for everyone whose first time it is coming to the group, welcome. Today, we're mostly going to go through kind of an audit of some newer security features that have been released in Snowflake since we last met. I guess more specifically in June and July of this past year. So yeah, I guess with that, I'll hand it over to Jack Beck to get us started.
Hey everybody, I'm Jack Beck. Got to meet some of you as you walked in, but I didn't get to shake hands with everybody. We'll take care of that afterwards. But yeah, today we're going to be kicking off the Snowflake user group with a demo of some security features that were released recently, specifically row level security. And kind of we'll just do a brief overview of what it is and how Snowflake has implemented it. And yeah, let's move to the next one. So just broadly, row level security is a feature implemented in databases that allows for fine-grained content-based access control, depending on user attributes or roles. I guess it would depend on your database system. In the case of Snowflake, it'll be role specific. This is really nice because it allows the security administrators to control access to database objects on a row level of granularity. So doing that will help to reduce the need for, I guess, extra or redundant data stores. An example that I keep going back to when I think about this kind of stuff is like a larger corporation that has multiple regions within their like operating field. Normally you might have different like data silos for each region, so the analysts from a certain region could only see their pertinent data. However, that can make the database structure a little messy, can incur extra storage costs if you've got some data overlap in there. But with row level security features, you can simplify that by having it all in one database and using those user attributes to control what the users see. So there's no need for those extra data stores, and it simplifies the end user experience by allowing, I guess, so instead of having to sit there and be like filtering for region NA or EU or whatever, you can just have it automatically as you query it. You only see the data that's relevant, right? Or in the case of Snowflake, you won't have to switch query context. And so that brings us to the implementation of row level security within Snowflake itself. Row access policies. We just started working with them recently. They seem really cool, and I think they'll have a lot of use in our client work. These were released in just this last July, so it's a fairly new feature. I don't know if anybody here has heard about them before, but they're super simple and easy to use. They work in conjunction with an older feature called dynamic data masking, which works at a column level. So by using both of them together, you can control a user's like field experience and then row level experience within those fields, which is a pretty neat addition. And as I mentioned earlier, doing so eliminates the need to silo data based on user group. And instead, you can just have it all lumped together and just filtered seamlessly based on the row access policy itself. And a nice thing about these, and we'll get to another slide next year, is the diverse use cases. It works with a variety of database objects within Snowflake, shares, external tables, pipelines, and all data types, including semi-structured. And so now we get to the coolest part of these row level access policies, which is their scalability. It's in line with Snowflake's general theme of being very seamless transition from small scale to large scale. So a policy administrator can simply create one policy, and assuming that the parameters for that policy are in line with other tables, the fields and stuff match up, you can apply it to theoretically infinite number of tables. So allowing you to scale easily throughout your organization. And I guess the intended structure for these is to kind of have a policy administrator who will write the policies and create them as they see fit. And then they'll have like a lower level data user or a data steward, I think I saw it referred to, that would go through and apply these throughout the organization. And there's two types of row access policies. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but there's like a simplified version and then a more complex version, which utilizes mapping tables. And in the demo that we're going to show you guys, that's what we tried to mimic. Obviously, it's not going to be on the same scale as you would see at a larger firm, but you can kind of imagine how using a mapping table, you could implement these policies throughout like a really wide variety of roles and have it scale pretty seamlessly. And I guess this is pretty much with a lot of the Snowflake features, but you're able to easily migrate these kinds of policies across accounts if need be, and which allows you to easily move it across regions and assure consistent security policy worldwide throughout your organization. And then next, I think we're about to hop into the demo with Logan here. Let's hope it all works. It probably will.
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Jack. So yeah, we're going to go through a relatively abridged version of the mapping table approach to working with row level security and row access policies today. So I'm happy to send this script out after. It's pretty translatable to any other instance, and it makes use of a pretty common sample data set, Snowflake's ecom data set that they offer up through data shares. So you can easily get in, mock this same approach to test it out for yourself, and even take it a little farther than I have. And I'll point out some of the places along the way that you can do that. So yeah, jumping straight in, a couple of prereqs right off the bat too that I'll call out. Going through this example assumes that either you as the person implementing it or at least, oh, you're good. Yeah, so it assumes that you yourself have both sysad and security ad, which often isn't the case. So in a real world scenario, this would all depend on you working alongside your organization's system admin and security admin.
So both. Logan, is that what you said? Okay.
Yeah, correct. And I'll point out some of the points in here too, where it's pertinent to have certain actions done by the system admin as opposed to the security admin. Okay. There's nothing directly, linking you to having to do it that way. It's just best practice to separate some of the role assignment and that type of stuff into security, and yeah, the object-based stuff was sysad. So anyway, to jump straight in, a couple just high-level context setting things. We're just going to pick our warehouses. Can be any smaller development testing warehouse that you work with in your org. And I'm also starting with just a general role, and I'll go through and make specific role changes as needed to point out the different steps that each admin would need to take. So yeah, right off the bat, the first thing that you'll want to do when implementing row access policies is work with your security admin to go in and set up any of the pertinent roles that you want to dynamically control access between. So in today's example, and this will probably become a bit more clear the further we go, but we're going to mock up an ecom use case where we have region-specific sales managers and then a department head, a sales executive, who should have access to the entirety of the sales data set, whereas specific sales managers are linked directly to a nation or region. So yeah, for this example's sake, we'll go through and these will actually fail because I've created these ahead of time, but create the three roles. Name does matter here, so just be conscientious and don't go deleting your statements here, so you can keep track of these role names. So once we've set those up, next step is, if you're running this demo for yourself, just to give yourself the permission to use those roles. In practice, this would be something, again, handled by the security admin and would be likely linked through some other Active Directory type user management service, instead of just running ad hoc queries like this. But for today's example, just so that you all can follow along in your own time, we'll go through and grant yourself the use of the roles that we just made above. So that's the initial step. Beyond that, you'll need to work with your system admin, or in this case, yourself, to then go in and in the wild, you would already have a database and schema and table set that you're looking to apply this to. But for today's example, we need to spin up just a little demo set of tables to do this on. So as sysad, I'm just going to create a demo database. I'm going to switch context to use that database. And then, as I mentioned earlier, today we'll just be replicating Snowflake's pretty widely used ecom sample data set. And we're just going to clone that existing data share, a smaller version of it into our new database so that we can apply all of our own access and security permissions to it. Let that churn for a minute and we can take a look at the next steps here. Again, while still operating as sysadmin, we're going to go through and grant usage and select on that new database that we just made. Again, in the wild, this is something that would be handled more dynamically through whatever your security process is. But in general, all we're doing here is just setting up functionality so that the apt, region-specific sales roles can make use of the tables that we've just created. So we'll jot through here. Get everyone set up. And at this point, I will just jump over just to show everything working from a user perspective to a separate sheet. And I'm going to use let's do the sales executive. Actually, I guess a better example would actually be a region-specific sales manager. So selected this role. And now if I go down and query our new customer table, I look in here and I see that despite being a US sales manager, I have access to records from multiple nations. And even though we don't have the direct name here, separate keys indicates that we are seeing records from customers in any number of regions and nations. So just want to point that out. We're at the point now where anyone with usage and select access on these tables, regardless of role, can see all records. So anyway, moving on to a bit more of the exciting stuff. I guess too, before I jump to the next one, I'll point out here that this approach to using sysad, creating our database, and then granting usage would apply to any schema or database owner role. In the wild, it could be that it's not necessarily your sysadmin, but instead a lower level admin that's specific to the finance department or specific to a different area would be the one actually creating these objects, and therefore would be the one that needs to grant usage. So just wanted to call that out. Yeah, moving on down from there, again, still as the sysadmin, since we're operating within that new database, we're going to create ourselves a security schema. Further down the road, this is going to act as a place where we can store security-centric objects, things like mapping tables, and that will be the location from which we then apply row masking policies. So just creating that schema. And now we get to the step of making that mapping table. So at the risk of steaming ahead, just to review real quickly, a mapping table in this case is basically going to store unique combinations of a given role name and then a corresponding key or anything that's specific to that role name that we'll want to later filter on when it comes to row access. So in this case, within that new security schema that we've just made, I'm going to create our new mapping table, sales manager nation. And for this simple example, we're just going to input two records for the region-specific roles that we made above, one for the US sales and one for Japan sales. So we'll insert those. Yeah, and then next step, we'll pivot again back to a few things the security admin would need to handle in this case, and that's going to be setting up the final pieces before we actually create and apply the row access policy. So switching over to security admin, we'll simply be creating a role whose only job is to handle queries to that mapping table that we just made. The reason for doing this is completely separating DDL and even just generally select access to those security tables, relegating all of that to a mapping role that in effect kind of acts like a service account and keeps general users, be it sysadmin, security admin, from accessing values there or adjusting what that mapping role or the mapping table can do and the values in it. So yeah, we'll create that role. Already got it created, so get an error there. And then just for clarity in this case, this isn't something you would normally do in the wild, but for the sake of this example and kind of showing you all further down the road, I'm going to grant myself access to use that role so that I can go in and later view the records there. Again, want to caution that this is a step you wouldn't normally want to take because it gives a specific user direct access to edit and view the values in that role has access to. So yeah, having done that, the last step here will simply be to then do exactly what I said, grant that new mapping role permission to query the security table, the security mapping table that we made earlier. All right, have I lost anyone yet? We're getting close. So the last batch here is, I guess, where the fun part happens. Again, switching back over to sysadmin, who I'll remind everyone now is the owner of this whole database. At this point, you would switch to whatever the schema or database owner is that you're looking to apply a row access policy to. In this case, it just happens to be sysadmin. So we'll switch there. And this next step is kind of the crux of the whole thing. So this is a DDL statement for creating row access policies. It has a lot of the same syntax as other DDL statements, general create row access policy. You can apply the same modifiers, create a replace, all that jazz. But in essence, what we're going to do here is define a policy name, and I have it fully specified here, so don't get lost in the database and schema. You don't have to fully specify this if you have your context set. We're just naming this new row access policy, Sales Nation policy demo. And then to get into what's being applied here, we're in effect saying, take an input from a field called Sales Nation key, and then run a Boolean check, a yes, no check on the following statement. So in that statement, we're looking for the user's current role to either be sales executive role or for a subselect of the mapping table that we just created to match a user's current role. And if you recall, we inserted some values that have a specific role name, and then also to match on the nation key value in that mapping table to the sales nation key that we're going to apply this row access policy to. A lot of words to basically say that if you happen to be using either that US sales manager or Japan sales manager role, once this row access policy is applied, behind the scenes, what Snowflake is going to do is basically assess which nation keys and whatever table you're selecting, you should be able to see records for. So yeah, I will run that again as sysadmin to create that new row access policy. And then last main step before this is all functional is simply to alter any table that we want to apply this row access policy to. So I'll start by just doing it with one in our ecom data set, and then I'll go over and show a couple DML statements and we'll talk next steps. But yeah, in effect, what this is doing, and I guess I'll point out too, you do it through an alter table statement. You will add a row access policy, fully qualified name for the one we just made, and then the key input is specifying the field name in the table you're applying it to that you want that row access policy to assess. So the field that you select here should be the same one that the row access policy is checking for above, in this case, Sales Nation key. So I'll grant that. And before I take this last step, I'll jump over now and run the same query I did earlier. So if you recall, I'm sitting here on our US sales manager role. And now if I go query customers, which is the table we applied this new row access policy to, you see that I'm only getting a subset of rows that are all customers in US. Similarly, switch to Japan, just to prove I'm not lying. Again, get all Japan subsets, and perhaps one of the most important ones in this example, making sure that the sales executive still has general access. Switch to that role, and we see that we're back to general access like we saw before prior to applying the row access policy. So at this point, I'll point out what the next step would be in a real world application, which would be mapping this row access policy to more than one table. So the real power of this row access policy as a distinct entity is that at least within this database currently, you can apply it across the board to multiple tables. So although we've gone in and done that for the customer table too, and it's a bit of a contrived example, I'll go in now and add it to a separate one that has a nation key that we can map to the same way that we have here. So if we go take a look at our ecom data set, I know off the top of my head that suppliers also has a nation key in here. So I can switch up the names a little bit. Now applying it to the supplier table on the correct nation key name. And I guess without babying anyone and going through the whole example again, I'll point out that the real power of this is now that we can control how this filtering is applied by just editing the single row access policy through subsequent DDL statements. So the power here is, you could have 200 tables that this policy is mapped to, and if a logic piece changes and the sales executive role goes by the wayside, or you have a new tier of access, a region, for example, where you need to see multiple nations for regional managers, you don't have to go update this in every place. You simply, through your security admin role, go in, update the row access policy, and you have a new level or conditional logic that gets applied when you're running these queries based on role. So the last step, and one that you would definitely want to make use of in the wild, is passing off ownership of a row access policy to that, I'll use the word agnostic mapping role that we created earlier. The reason here again being that in the wild, you don't want a specific user to have ready access to that role and its the objects that it has access to. You want it to live as like I said, essentially, a service account, I guess, for lack of a better example, operating behind the scenes, but not having direct access to or from any specific user. The one caveat there is that, if you do need to subsequently go in and update a row access policy, you have one of two approaches. You can either transfer ownership back to, a security admin role or something of the sort, or like my example above, you can simply give specific users temporary access to go in and make those changes. So I'll stop there. I know that seemed like a decent amount, but that gets us through the example. Are there any questions on that use case or specific setup stuff?
Can you make that mapping table value an array and add multiple?
Yeah. So you're thinking have nested values for a given user? Yeah, you can. Then in the, I guess to use this example as a reference, in the subselect here, you would just use typical lateral flatten logic to pivot it out and run the same Boolean check. But yeah, that is possible. It's really flexible as far as the Boolean checks that you can set up in here, and you can daisy chain them for days through just more or statements and subselects like this. And I guess, again, I'll call out to a point that Jack made earlier that this example doesn't necessarily cover, is that everything we've done here is at the role level. And for most use cases, that's probably the most apt way to do it. But you could technically apply these same conditional checks to users or really into any entity in your instance, your Snowflake instance. So role is definitely the safest and best practice, but there could be use cases for individual users.
The other call out I would make would be just because I know you encountered it when you're setting it up, the case sensitivity is an important
That's
thing
a good point.
between the roles, and I think you guys probably noticed
You
it.
upper,
Yeah, that's a great catch. Yeah.
Sorry,
As a
what?
best
Say that
practice.
again,
Yeah.
Jack?
It's the row masking policy or the row access policy is case specific. So even though he has these roles spelled out in lowercase,
Yeah,
Snowflake ends up interpreting it in the context as an uppercase value.
okay.
And when Logan first ran through this, he was like, it's not working and I have no idea why. And it was because it was looking for an uppercase and he was inputting the lowercase.
No way.
Okay.
So where you have, pardon me, the sales executive role, if you had not made
Right.
that
Yeah,
uppercase, it would have failed.
Yes.
Okay,
and by far the easier fix is whenever, in whatever system that's updating your mapping
Yeah.
tables, to just wrap everything in an upper there and have it never have to make that assessment. So that
That's
this
a
is
good
effective.
tip for someone just starting.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks for doing it, guys.
Cool,
Really
thank
appreciate it.
you.
for sure. Nice. We'll drop us off the recording unless anyone on the call has more questions.
Do we still have?
I think that was great, Logan. Yeah. Thank you for the other folks who joined the call.
Totally.
And you all missed pizza.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone for
everyone.
joining.
Have a
All
great night.
right, take care.